Hello and welcome to another edition of Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills. I am Brian Steele Wills. We've celebrated St. Patrick's Day this past week, so we thought we would do a special sort of St. Patrick's Day program on one of the really top-notch Confederate generals named Patrick Ronan Cleburne, sometimes known as the Stonewall of the West. He was a talented and really efficient and effective Confederate general who served very well and, unfortunately for the South, gave his life at the end of the war at the Battle of Franklin. We'll talk about that a little bit in a few minutes. Just to give a little description of him, he was a little over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, had gray and blue eyes, and or gray-blue eyes, we'll call it that, and came from Ireland originally, County Cork, Ireland. Really born on St. Patrick's Day Eve, though a lot of people credit that he was born on St. Patrick's Day. He was really born in the evening just prior to, in 1828. His dad was a doctor, and he was the third child of the family and the second son, so he was kind of right in the middle. Very unusual in a lot of ways because his family was middle class and Protestant in a ordinarily Catholic country, but that made them sort of a little bit unique. His mother died when he was young, and his father remarried, and he would end up with 3 more half-siblings by virtue of that remarriage. Probably the top-notch historian and biographer of Pat Cleburne is a guy named Craig Simons. Many of you probably know Craig that are listening. You would have gone to programs with him. We had him speak to our Civil War Center programs a couple of times in Kennesaw before I retired. And he said of Cleburne's roots, it meant that he had the advantage of a formal education, though it was abbreviated at age 15 by his father's death. It made him comfortable in leadership roles despite an innate shyness. And everywhere I've read that he was shy, but he overcame that, especially in the company of men. So if he was in a group of men, he stood out. But everyone else, he sort of stood back and was quiet. And as Simon says, it made him socially ambitious, a trait which he brought with him to America. So he will end up immigrating to the United States, but as Craig points out, he was a person who had already sort of set his personality in place before he came to his new home. His first name was Patrick, but his middle name was Ronan, and apparently Ronan was what people called him back in the old country. And his father being a doctor, he had originally apprenticed in medicine and thought that he would enroll in school, but he failed the entrance exam, and because he failed the entrance exam, he felt some embarrassment. Understandably, I think he wanted to make his father proud, and he ended up not really following, or he wanted to make his family proud. Let's say it that way. But he decided to go into a different type of environment. He went into the Army. So he enlisted in Her Majesty's 41st Regiment of Foot, which was an infantry regiment. But he didn't go to India as he sort of thought he might in the initial deployment. He thought he would go overseas, but he ended up staying in Ireland, where mostly he served against the Irish rebellions that were taking place against Great Britain. As I mentioned, his father died very shortly after he had left to go into the Army, but he stayed in the service, ended up being promoted to corporal in 1849, and then he came back home to find that the family farm was in serious trouble. They had not paid all their taxes, and so the decision was made that maybe we need to have a fresh start, so we'll come to America. So he, his older sister, and his 2 brothers got on a ship coming to the United States, and ended up deciding to come to America. Because, again, of that background that he had in Ireland, he actually thought about being an apothecary in Cincinnati but he ended up moving ultimately to out west to Helena, Arkansas, and that's really what shaped his adult life more than anything else, because he really blended into Arkansas society quite well, and he embraced it. He became a partner in a drugstore. He studied law. He ended up being an American citizen, a U.S. citizen in 1855, and he passed the Arkansas bar so he could practice law. The state very much became his new home. He was one of those people that bought the American dream, the Arkansas dream, hook, line, and sinker. So he will end up staying there and being a part of that society in every meaningful way. He becomes very active. He's a Democrat, supports his law partner, Thomas Heinemann. Heinemann will run for the Senate, and he'll support him. And one of those freak things that happens so often on the frontier, one of the opponents, the opponent of Thomas Heinemann, they ended up having a fight in the streets. And right there in the streets of Helena, Arkansas, he ended up being wounded in a street brawl with this person that Heinemann was running against. Claiborne did not own slaves, and he opposed the institution, but he certainly supported, as I mentioned, the Democratic Party and the Southern way of life. So when the country unraveled after Abraham Lincoln's election, and that led first to South Carolina seceding from the Union, and then the other Deep South states seceded as well. He was going to, keep a sharp eye, but an eye that would certainly be aimed toward the South. I mean, he was certainly going to go where his fellow Southerners went. They decided to form a militia unit of their own, and I guess sort of practice what might come to be some hostilities in the future, but get prepared. So they created they organized a group of militia called the Yell Rifles. The leading citizens that included Pat Claiborne formed this group named for former Arkansas Governor Archibald Yell. Yell had been in the Mexican-American War, had been I think it was Buena Vista is where he was when he was, died there in the Mexican-American War. But they named it after him, and the Yell Rifles elected Claiborne to be their captain. So they recognized in him leadership qualities that they tapped into right away. And a lot of that, of course, was because he'd been in the British service, the Royal Service, and so he brought that kind of military experience with him and used it to drill his unit and make it more efficient than a lot of these types of units would be. So many of them were really kind of social clubs more than anything else. They sort of gathered for the excuse of kind of getting out and doing things together, and I'm sure getting away from home for a little while. So as the national events unfolded, the firing on Fort Sumter led to Abraham Lincoln's call for volunteers. That would have meant that every state that stayed in the Union was required to give a quota, and that would have meant that Arkansas had to give a quota as well. And those troops would then be used to supposedly suppress the rebellion. In other words, the troops that were raised in these units would be sent south against their fellow sister southern states. And so it led to a second round of secession. The upper South states of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee will go out of the Union in that second wave of secession. And Virginia had actually originally voted against secession, and the vote in this second realm when Lincoln called for volunteers to go against the other southern states, that vote flip-flopped. It was almost exactly the same for secession. And so Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the other Confederate states. Arkansas went out on May 6th. So Arkansas's fight is going to end up being Pat Claiborne's fight, as he supposedly told someone, "I'm with Arkansas in weal and woe." He did have that good Irish brogue, so I probably should have said that in an Irish brogue, but I'll leave that off so that we don't become a comedy hour instead of history hour. At any rate, Claiborne's company became part of what turned into the 1st Arkansas Volunteer Infantry, and he won election as colonel. The numbers, of course, changed a lot through the war, but the initial designation was the 1st Arkansas. And the regiment comes to be part of what will be famously the Army of Tennessee. Claiborne's going to be promoted to Brigadier General in March 4th of 1862, which was a pretty big deal. I mean, to turn this Irishman turned Southerner into a Confederate general would be pretty impressive. After that, in April, they're going to involve themselves in the fighting around Pittsburgh Landing and Shiloh after the disasters of Fort Henry and Donelson in February and Mill Springs in January. The Confederates had lost a lot of western Tennessee, and they ended up kind of being pushed all the way back into the area around Corinth, Mississippi. And then Albert Sidney Johnston, the commander of the Army, led it in a surprise attack against Ulysses Grant and other generals, including William T. Sherman as well, at Shiloh. And at Shiloh, Pat Claiborne gets into a situation that's pretty desperate. If you've ever been to Shiloh, it's one of my favorite parks to go to. It's really very pristine. You can see the territory that Claiborne's men will assault and understand the topographical challenges, because you'll see that they had to come out of this really low-lying swampy area and come up a hill into the teeth of William T. Sherman's forces for the most part, and basically in the teeth of a bunch of artillery pieces that pretty much chewed them to pieces before they could get to the top. And eventually that Union line will collapse. They'll go on and be pushed through the Union camps, and then have a sort of final line of, they call it Grant's last line of defense. Grant had actually been up at his headquarters in a little town called Savannah, Tennessee, and he came to join in trying to resurrect things and get the troops reorganized. And that night, he and Sherman sort of get their wits about them. Although the one thing I think you'll learn about Grant is that you can usually take him on day one, but if there's a day two, it's not going to work out for you. So if you're his opponent, and it's at Shiloh, that was certainly the case. Day two, it was no longer Albert Sidney Johnston. He had been wounded and bled to death in trying to lead his men to further attacks. And P.G.T. Beauregard, he dropped the Pierre and called himself Gustave Toutant Beauregard. He would be the commander then that stepped up and actually thought he would finish off the Federal forces the next day. And the next day, Don Carlos Buell's troops were starting to come in, and Grant's troops got reorganized. And between the two of them, they reversed the situation and drove the Confederates back over the ground that the Confederates had driven the Federals the day before. So if you ever want to go to a battlefield that's impressive, I would suggest Shiloh is one of those battlefields. One of the next campaigns that Claiborne's going to be involved with is in the Kentucky campaign that Braxton Bragg launches at the same time Robert E. Lee launches his, or just about the same time that Robert E. Lee launches his Maryland campaign. They're not simultaneous, but they're in the same general time of year. And in the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, on August 30th, Claiborne actually suffers a severe wound. He's hit by a round in the cheek. Has all kinds of issues with trying to continue to give orders as the swelling begins to make it hard for him to speak. Of course, he already had that Irish brogue anyway, but he's really got great difficulty giving reasonable orders, and he ends up having to give up command for the rest of that engagement, which is very unusual for him. He liked to be at the front. But that facial wound will take him out for a short period of time, but he's able to return for the Battle of Perryville, which is the big battle of the Kentucky campaign in October. He'll end up being promoted to Major General, one of only two foreign-born Major Generals in the Confederacy, the only Irish Major General, and he will end up being, just building on this reputation as one of the most effective combat generals for the Confederacy. Very distinctive in his fighting style, and his flag, that blue battle flag, a Hardee flag, becomes symbolic to his foes, and wherever they see that, they know they're in for hard fighting. Due to time, we can't go into all the details, but he will be involved in other major campaigns in Murfreesboro, Stones River, and at Chickamauga, and then he will fight at Chattanooga, where the Confederates had driven the Federals back to Chattanooga and were quote-unquote laying siege to the town. They hadn't cut it off 100%. They had cut it pretty severely, and a trickle of supplies only were coming into the Army of the Cumberland at that point, and their rations got cut quite severely. But Rosecrans, William Stark Rosecrans, who'd been commander at Chickamauga, got replaced by George Henry Thomas. George Henry Thomas was a Virginian who stayed with the Union and ended up becoming known as the Rock of Chickamauga because he held out long enough to let the remnants of the Army retreat to Chattanooga intact when the rest of the Army had broken and gone less intact, we'll say it that way. And supposedly the comment was that Rosecrans was acting like he had been hit on the head like a stunned duck. And Thomas ends up taking his place, but that's short term because Ulysses Grant is going to come from the Mississippi River area and work his way over to take over in Chattanooga. And he's going to send for William Tecumseh Sherman, who he had a really symbiotic relationship with. They got along well. They waged war the same way. And Sherman's going to come in to sort of be the sledgehammer in Ulysses Grant's forces. Grant had initially, when he met with Thomas, it was kind of an awkward meeting. Thomas didn't know he was coming. Grant came in soaking wet, and for a little while, Thomas was a little bit thrown off by Grant being there, and some people read a lot into that. But what it was is, I just think he caught him off guard. And Thomas liked to be prepared for almost anything, and the appearance of Grant, unexpected, I think, threw him off a little bit. But once he got kind of together, he was very good in working with General Grant. So there's not an antagonism between Thomas and Grant the way some people think there was, but and use this incident as an example. But one of the people that I've written about was George Henry Thomas. I wrote a book with his name in the title as True as Steel, and I will say that I came to really see less antagonism between the two than the fact that they just didn't wage war the same way. Thomas did not fight the war the way that Grant and Sherman fought it. So Sherman was being brought in to do the job that Grant felt like Thomas was not showing the greatest enthusiasm towards doing. But in some ways, Grant was trying to get Thomas to make an assault before Thomas felt like the Army was in position to be successful, and he was arguing that they needed more time to get everything together for a future attack. So I think part of that, again, was that Sherman was brought in to push things along. And the irony is that when Sherman does make a surprise attack on the Confederate right, the troops he runs into are Patrick Cleburne's troops. And for several reasons, Sherman's inability to understand that there was actually kind of two ridge lines, and then Cleburne's very stout defense kept Sherman from turning the Confederate line. So Sherman's attack was unsuccessful. And then after that, the attack straight up Missionary Ridge is what actually drove Braxton Bragg off of the line and broke the siege, if you will, of Chattanooga. And the Federals continued to push the Confederates, and it was Pat Cleburne who pretty much saved the day at Ringgold Gap with a very, very stout defense there that saved the Army in a lot of ways and secured for him the thanks of the Confederate Congress. Then on January 2nd, 1864, Patrick Cleburne did something very unusual. He made a proposal that if any slaves would join the Confederate forces to fight, they would be given their freedom for that service, for their faithful service. And this proposal or memorial was being put forward because Cleburne realized that the Confederacy was suffering from lack of manpower. It needed troops. And he thought that if the slaves could be given the chance of freedom and the chance to fight for, quote unquote, their own home, the South, that they might do that, and that the Confederacy could then try to fill some of these ranks with the troops that they would then provide. And the rest of the Confederacy wasn't quite ready for that. President Davis will suppress the idea, and it's when it's finally sort of revisited, it's very late in the war, and even Robert E. Lee had sort of pushed it by then, but it didn't matter. It was 1865, and the war was already basically over, and Cleburne, ironically, was gone. Cleburne will be engaged in 1864 in the Atlanta campaign. He does a magnificent job there. His greatest moments are at Pickett's Mill in what comes to be termed the hellhole of Georgia, and at Kennesaw Mountain, where he does a fabulous job with Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, and they repulse the attacks made by Union forces largely under George Henry Thomas, and the idea was to punch a hole through Joseph Johnston's line and smash the Confederate defenses to make the access, if you will, to Atlanta. And for Benjamin Franklin Cheatham, it comes to be known as Cheatham's Hill, but Cleburne is right there alongside, and they both help turn back these Union forces. Because Johnston continues to retreat, and he does retreat even from the Kennesaw line, he gets replaced. John Bell Hood comes in as the new commander, and it's at that point that Hood tries to save the city of Atlanta with multiple attacks and end up failing. Atlanta has to be evacuated, and eventually the Army of Tennessee will march under Hood into Tennessee, its namesake state, and Cleburne will be a part of that effort as well. They will fail to stop John Schofield from getting past at Spring Hill, the missed opportunity that then John Bell Hood decides to take it out on his army by attacking Schofield and the defenses around Franklin. At that time, George Henry Thomas was at Nashville, and Schofield was trying to work his way back to Thomas when the situation is that I mentioned that Spring Hill's a missed opportunity. The Confederates couldn't catch and cut them off, so they're going to attack directly at Franklin. And the situation there becomes untenable for a successful Confederate assault, because an angry Hood decides to make the direct assault in a massive charge that actually included more troops and covered more ground than Pickett's famous charge at Gettysburg late in the day on November 30th. And this will be the attack that costs the Confederacy tremendous numbers of troops, but also general officers. One of the Confederate generals was named Govan, and he said to Claiborne, he says, "Well, General, there won't be many of us that will get back to Arkansas." And Claiborne looked at him and said, "Well, Govan, if we are to die, let us die like men." And so they attacked the Union position. It's simply too strong to overwhelm, even though there was a slight, almost moment where you thought that might happen. Some of the Union troops were out in front of the main line, and the idea was that maybe you could follow them into the defenses, but troops under Emerson Opdyke helped to seal that breach and keep that from breaking through. Claiborne was one of a number of Confederate generals who died in the process, killed along with 5 other general officers who were killed or mortally wounded, and some 6,000 Confederates were killed or wounded in that attack. The shattered army then moved on ultimately to Nashville, but it was only a shadow of itself. He's going to be buried initially in Columbia, Tennessee, but then his remains were reinterred in 1870 to his home, away from home, you might say, of Helena, Arkansas, and that's where, if you want to go, you can see a marker that shows him and tells about him as I think, a genuine hero of the South. As I mentioned, Craig Simons has written about him. A lot of us have written about him in one way or the other. Certainly one of the best generals the Confederacy had, energetic, tough, intelligent. He was the fellow who decided that sharpshooting might be a good thing to do, but they only had so many really good Whitworth rifles from England, so he held contests, and he ended up giving the prized weapons to the ones who won the contests. So very innovative, as the proposal, a memorial about the slaves showed, as the use of weapons showed, as his tactics on the battlefield showed. He was certainly competent, steady, and determined to demonstrate excellence in the battlefield, and in many ways, I think, showed that he was one of the finest generals on both sides, but certainly in the Confederate service. So that's a little bit about Pat Claiborne. I thought you might want to hear on the just after the week of St. Patrick's Day. I hope everybody has a good and healthy and happy coming week. Maybe we can get together. I'm going to be a little bit on the road for a little while, but maybe we can get back together, and I'm sure my able assistant will help us get a new podcast going. But for now, let me thank you for tuning in and listening, and hope to see you again on Civil War Reflections with Brian Steele Wills.